This morning we're going to go back into Matthew. The passage that we're going to look at this morning is actually a backward step. I'm going to do a little bit of a rewind. You may remember that we were in Matthew 19 last week, and just as I've been praying about things and kind of thinking about how to move forward in Matthew, my mind kind of keeps getting pulled back to this parable that's actually in Matthew 18. And I thought there were really some things there that the Lord kind of put on my heart to share with y'all, and so I'm going to do that. But before we jump in, let me just say a couple of things. You know me well enough to know that I'm very big on meaning first and then application. And that the meaning is very important to me in terms of the why. Why should I think that what you're telling me is true? Why, what reasons can you give me for agreeing with you? That's very, very important to me, and there's a reason. The reason is because anybody can come up with an application based on their particular interpretation, but do you know, why that is correct? And does that make a difference? Well, flip through the channels. See how far you have to flip through the channels before you get the televangelist who's sitting there going, and they pull out that Bible and says, well, you reap what you sow. You reap what you sow. And what they would tell you that means, because all they really want to do is get to the application, but what they would tell you that means is that if you give to my ministry, in other words, if you sow to my ministry, then you will reap, the benefits of having given to my ministry. Okay? Is that hitting anybody the wrong way like it does me? I hope it does. Because that's assuming the meaning in order to get to that application where put the money in my pocket. Need that moolah, right? And that's based on an interpretation without any reason why. So are the reasons important to me? Absolutely. So I'm always going to go to meaning first. And this is a case in point, because the passage that we're going to look at today and the parable that we're going to talk about has at least 4 different views, 4 different interpretations. And which particular interpretation you take will determine the application that you make. So that's what we're going to get into today. All right? We're going to look at Matthew 18. And before we get to the parable, I want to walk you through a little bit of the context so that we know kind of where we're moving forward and how we're getting to this parable that Jesus gives. And it's a very powerful parable, I think you'll see when we get to it. But we've spoken already about the beginning of Matthew 18. I'm just going to read through just a few verses to give you the flavor of what Jesus is teaching his disciples. In Matthew 18, verse 2, he says, Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, assuredly I say to you, unless you're converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And you may remember that the parallel passage in Mark has Jesus wrapping his arms around that very little child. So what we're beginning to see is that Jesus is comparing, this is called an object lesson, Jesus is comparing this little child that he has his arms wrapped around to the Father's children. In other words, believers. The family, the sons and daughters, all right, of the Father. So he goes on in verse 5, whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. In other words, that family relationship is that important. Verse 6, I'm going to read it the way it's normally read, and then I'm going to ask you to reread it. But let me look at verse 6. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone was hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. We read that, and very often it's about the guy who gets thrown in the sea. I would ask you to reread it this morning. Take a look at the first part of that. How important are his children to him? That's how important his children are to him. If somebody gets in the way, if somebody causes them to go astray, it would be better if they just got tossed in the ocean. Why? Because his children are that important to him. All right? All right, so jumping down to verse 10 and moving forward. Take heed that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I say to you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. And we know we have the story between verses 12 and 13 about the 100 sheep and the one that wanders away. Well, in the context, the one that wanders away is the one that's been caused to sin. So he's wandered away, and it's the shepherd says, man, I got to go find that one. Why? Because he cares about all of the sheep. And in the context, you can see his conclusion is in verse 14. Even so, it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. Very clearly an allusion to this group is who he's talking about, the little ones. Which little ones? The little ones who believe in him. Believers. Okay? So, you get the picture so far of the father having care for his children. And I don't know about you, if you're a dad, how far would you go to protect your kid? How much do you care about their welfare? I speak as a parent, there's nothing I wouldn't do. You know, and that's Jesus' point through this whole section, is to say, like, look, if you're talking about the father and his care for his children, those who are his sons and daughters, there's nothing he's not going to do to go after them, to pull them back, to bring them back into relationship with the rest of the family. You move forward from verse 14, the very next verse, he says, therefore, if your brother, your brother, he switches, he's been using these little children all the way down. Well, he's not changing the subject. He's just changing the focus. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him. In other words, just like the shepherd goes after the sheep, you go after your brother. Don't sit back and wait for them to come to you. You're a family. You're brothers and sisters. Go after them just like the shepherd would go after that sheep that was straying. So we have that whole section that is about how to deal with a brother who has gone astray. And it's basically try to redeem, try to bring them back, try to restore that relationship, try to bring them back to the place where you're together and you're unified again. And then Matthew 18:21, that brings us to the passage that we want to talk about today. In Matthew 18:21, then Peter came and said to him, and it's another continuation of the same conversation. Remember, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Well, in the rabbinic tradition, here the disciples are. They've got all this Jewish background. So for them, Peter's actually he's kind of going overboard. Because in rabbinic tradition, it was very common to say three times. You want to know how often to forgive somebody? You forgive them a first time. You just look and okay, then you do it again. You forgive them a second time, and then then they do it a third time. You just okay, and then as soon as that's passed, it's like, all right, now the hammer drops. All right. So here's Peter saying, well, how about 7? That's pretty good. We'll be easier on them, right? And Jesus says, I'm not going to say to you up to 7 times. How about 70 times 7? Well, some people, if they're mathematicians, go, well, 490. You ever going to make it to 490? Anybody a perfectionist enough to say, well, I'll write it down and I'll keep a log and figure out how many times. As soon as they hit 489, it's like, uh-oh. Obviously that's not Jesus' point. Jesus' point is like, look, just keep on forgiving. Just keep on forgiving. All right? So that brings us to the parable. And I know many of you in the room, you've heard this parable, so we can walk through it and see what it has to say to us. Therefore, and again, as a result of him saying, you need to forgive your brother 70 times 7. Just keep on forgiving. It says, the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And when he had begun to settle accounts, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. But as he was not able to pay, his master commanded that he be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and that payment may be made. Now remember, the context is among brothers and sisters. Peter is asking, how many times do I forgive my brother? So again, this whole idea of brothers and sisters, people who are on that same footing. And Jesus says, okay, you want to know what it looks like? It looks like a king who's settling accounts with his servants. The servants are on the same level, but the king is over them. And obviously we don't have to go very far before we say, what king are we talking about? Well, we'd be talking about God, right? I mean, in this parable, that's the idea, is that we're talking about God, and God is the one who has the ability and the authority to settle accounts, does he not? He is the righteous judge, is he not? Yeah. So, who is this guy who owes him 10,000 talents? Let's talk about what 10,000 talents look like, and then maybe we can figure out who that person might be. 10,000 talents, you look up and you go, well, that doesn't mean anything to me. So we're going to break it down here for just a second. 1 talent is 6,000 denarii. 6,000 denarii. 1 is a denarius. Any more than that, you got denarii, okay, with a double I. So 1 talent is 6,000 denarii. Now, what you need to know is that 1 denarii was enough for 1 day of meals. It was basically 1 day's pay, all right? So if 1 talent is 6,000 of those, and again, for each of us, it's like, how much do I need to live for a day? How much do I need to put food on the table for a day? That's hard to answer, but what I can tell you is that historically, 1 denarius was enough to feed people. It was like a day's pay. So if 1 talent is 6,000 of those, you're talking about 6,000 days in order to sort of make that come about in terms of a break even, right? 10,000 talents, therefore, is 60 million denarii. All right? So, put that in perspective. Here's this guy. He comes before the king. He owes the king 10,000 talents. All right? And the king is looking at him, and the guy's got, I owe you 10,000 talents. Well, what would that look like? That would look like if the servant served him for 7 days a week, 365 days a year, he would pay it off in 164,383 years. Okay? Anybody else besides me hearing last week when we talked about the rich young ruler who was thinking that he could kind of approach God in that way? And what did Jesus say in the end? With men, it's impossible. It's impossible. Okay, well, let's give the guy a day off per week, right? Let's say if he's going to go 6 days a week, we'll give him a day off every week, so he only has to work 6 days a week. Well, then he's got to pay it off in 192,307 years. All right? Obviously, the result here is absolute impossibility. It's ridiculous. It's to the point of absurdity, right? So who is this guy? Well, that could be everybody on the face of the planet, right? I mean, if what we're talking about is offense or sin, and the king is God, well, then the idea is, this is a person who comes before God, and I've got a debt there is absolutely no way on God's green earth that I can pay. And if we think about ourselves, if I think about myself for a second and I go, okay, if I go back to when I was a little kid and then I began to say things that I shouldn't say, do things that I shouldn't do, make decisions that I shouldn't have made, and I worked that across the number of weeks and months and years, and multiply that out, what do I have to offer God? How on what basis would I claim that I could ever pay that penalty or pay that back? It's up to the king, right? And that's what we find. Let's go a little bit further. Verse 26, the servant therefore fell down before him and saying, Master, have patience with me and I will pay you all. Now, of course, the king knew, there's no way, that's not going to happen. But what this did tell the king was that the servant recognized that the king was the only one who had the authority to do anything about his debt. Right? So the master of that servant was moved with compassion, released him, and take a look at this last one, okay? Here's this guy who's going to have to work for 193,000 years if he only works 6 days a week, right? And the king says, forgiven. Forgiven. You're released. Everybody, I mean, do we need to talk about the gospel in that regard? Right? So what we're talking about is somebody that has a debt they can't pay. Their penalty is incredibly great. And you have a king who says, look, I forgive you. Amen. Right? And I have the authority to do that. So, amazing thing even before we go further. But this is where the story takes a curve. That servant, and this is verse 28, that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. He laid hands on him and took him by the throat, saying, pay me what you owe. And again, recognize a couple things here. It's a fellow servant, somebody in the same boat, right? On the level playing field. And his fellow servant owed him 100 denarii. Well, that'd be 100 days. If we're talking about a day's wage, it would take him 100 days, less than a third of a year, and he'd be able to pay it off, okay? But it's, again, between servants. He laid hands on him and took him by the throat. In other words, he got violent. It was that important to him to have that offense taken care of, that debt taken care of. He said, pay me what you owe me. So his fellow servant, and notice verse 29, sounds a lot like what he had just done, right? His fellow servant fell down at his feet and begged him, saying, have patience with me, and I will pay you all. Sounds exactly like verse 26. But he wouldn't. And he went and threw him into prison until he should pay the debt. Notice what happens next. And I invite you to put it into the context of the church, because that's really what Jesus is addressing. And again, in the context, the larger context is that idea that God, as Father, is concerned about all his children and wants all of his children to live together, loving each other, encouraging each other, forgiving each other. And this stops it. This stops it. And you're like, look, I just forgave you that much. And you're going to go after the guy who owes you that much. So, notice what happens next. When his fellow servants saw what had been done, they were very grieved and came and told their master all that had been done. Notice that instead of going to others and telling the bad thing that had been done, what did they do when they found out all that? They went to the king. They went to the master. So if we're talking about our context, what would that look like? That would be something called prayer. That would be something called prayer. That would be, I see this. You notice what their reaction is. They were very grieved. Very grieved. And that should be us too. When we're in a church body, we're in a body of believers where there are brothers and sisters who are supposed to be loving each other, caring for each other, encouraging each other, saying good things about each other. When we watch that get in the way, and we see what's going on when those things get in the way, that should be our response. We should be very grieved because it ought not be so. And the response of our heart should be, Lord, please bring healing. Bring healing. Because this was an injustice. Given your grace, what is happening here is not in line with that. And I would say part of that equation is because each of those fellow servants was in the same situation of having known that they had that much debt that they were supposed to pay because of what they had done. And they had been forgiven by the same king. As a result, they said, no, this should not be so. So then his master, after he had called him, said to him, you wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt. I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. should you not also have had compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you? I had that much pity on you. I gave you that much mercy. I forgave you that much. And you're not willing to do that much? Something wrong with that picture. His master was angry and delivered him to the torturers until he should pay all that was due to him. This is the particular verse that gets debated, all right? And you can imagine why. I mean, listen to the tone of it. Delivered him to the torturers, right? That's kind of hard to hear. And some interesting things get done with this particular verse. This verse gets used to teach purgatory, all right? So, well, because you didn't forgive, you go to purgatory. And then when you're in purgatory, you kind of pay it off. And then once you pay it off, then you can, proceed to heaven. So now that's nowhere else in the New Testament, and it doesn't fit the context necessarily. One of the other things that's done with this verse is that people will say, well, this makes it clear that he's an unbeliever, and the torturers is hell. And since he's obviously not going to be able to pay the debt, it basically just means he goes to hell forever. Well, the problem with that is that doesn't fit the rest of the parable, nor the context of Matthew 18, which is clearly about these little ones who believe in me, who are brothers and sisters. And in the context, in the immediate context, what did the king just say to him? I forgave you. I forgave you. So to say that this is an unbeliever does not work anywhere in this context. But if we say it's a believer, what would Jesus mean? Why would he say something like that about a believer? Because here he is with these brothers and sisters, and he doesn't forgive one of his brothers, his fellow servants. And so he's handed over to the torturers. Pretty strong statement. Beyond that, in argument for this being a believer, take a look at verse 35, which is Jesus' conclusion. So, and there's a comparison, so my heavenly Father also will do to you if each of you from his heart does not forgive who? His brother, his trespasses. Well, it's a pretty strong statement. Let me draw some conclusions from this passage in terms of tying it all together. Because I think that the torturer's piece is just a natural consequence when someone fails to forgive. But before I get there and go further with that, let me pull it back to the beginning of the parable. Because I think this parable has several really, really, really important points to make for us. Number one, Jesus is pointing us to the magnitude of the grace of God. What we have is a God who understands and knows every single one of us and knows every single thing that we have done for our entire life. And guess what he says? I forgive you. I forgive you. And if you're here this morning and you've never trusted Jesus Christ to be the one to pay that penalty for you, that price has been paid by him on the cross. And as a result of that price already being paid, every single mistake, every single error, every single unwise decision you have ever made can be wiped out by the King. And he simply says to you, as a result of being the one who paid it, will you receive me? Will you receive my forgiveness? Will you trust me to cover all of that? If you have not, I invite you to do that this morning. But beyond that, I would say this entire chapter, including this parable, is to show us how seriously God wants his family, his sons and daughters, to love and encourage each other. And guess what? If you fail to forgive, it stops it. You cannot love someone if you are holding on to something that they have done to you. If you are holding that against them, you will fail to love them. Much less show them favor, which is what God's desire is for his sons and daughters, right? Because he's shown us love, he continues to show us favor. What he wants for his sons and daughters is to reflect him and to show love and favor to all the sons and daughters. But what happens is you hold it against someone, you fail to forgive, and that love and that favor just drops right off the plate. It is not going to happen. And guess what? That's a fail. That's a fail. Bitterness will do that. How about, what other things do we see in here? When we talk about him being delivered over to the torturers, I would say Jesus is saying, like, look, if you understand the power of forgiveness, then when you fail to forgive, there are consequences. And if you don't want to pay the consequences, then forgive. Then forgive. And the idea there is when you fail to forgive, you put yourself in prison. You put yourself under the torturers. There are natural consequences that occur when we hang on to offense, when we hang on to the things that people have done to us. But it's the easy thing, isn't it? It is the easy thing to hang on to that. Just this week, I was talking with one of the brothers here. I said, just this week, I had a Brazilian pastor who sent me an article that he had read that came out of a British newspaper. And I was thinking about and praying about this sermon, and I was like, whoa, that's pretty good timing. Have a listen. Have a listen. Most of us are subjected to insults, sarcastic comments, or bad feedback in our everyday lives. But we weren't built to deal with torrents of criticism. As children, we're often told that sticks and stones can break bones, but words can never hurt. Yet with the benefit of experience, adults understand that this old proverb is far from true. While physical injuries can take a matter of weeks to heal, negative comments can scar us for a lifetime. Whether it's criticism calmly dispensed by a teacher at school or a cruel comment hurled in the heat of an argument with a friend or spouse, we tend to remember criticism far better than positive comments due to a phenomenon called the negativity bias. In fact, a whole host of complex effects can be explained by this bias, which is the universal tendency for negative emotions to affect us more strongly than the positive ones. You think Jesus might have known some of this? I do. It causes us to pay special attention to threats and exaggerate the dangers. While worrying about a hypothetical but horrific situation can make us fearful, we all understand that after the last couple of years, right? Just one small bad experience can have a disproportionate impact on our whole day. Boy, I understand that one too, don't I? Yeah, we all do. Randy Larson, professor of psychological and brain sciences at Washington University in St. Louis, reviewed evidence suggesting negative emotions last longer than happy ones. All right? He found we tend to spend more time thinking about bad events than good ones, perhaps helping to explain why embarrassing moments or critical comments can haunt us for years. It can be hard not to dwell on hurtful comments from a spouse, family member, or a friend. I would think negative comments from the people we love and trust, that is sons and daughters, brothers, sisters. Negative comments from the people we love and trust would have more impact than those from strangers, says Baumeister. This is partly because we have expectations of how our friends and family should behave toward us. In some cases, negative remarks from people we love can lead to long-lasting mental wounds and resentment that can cause relationships to break down. No kidding. No kidding. You know, we think about why would Jesus make such a big deal in this parable and make such a big, use lots of exaggeration to try to make his point? Because he knew all that. He knew all that. And what this article does not address is that Jesus has given us in this parable the way out. The way out. Because of all those wounds and all the things that we hold in. And he said, no, you need to keep forgiving. Why? Because forgiveness in the original word means to let go. let it go. Because he knew, like this article says, when you hang on to it, it's self-destructive. It will eat you up. As you're busy holding that in and hanging on to that thing that somebody did wrong to you, as small as that is in the bigger picture of God's grace, you've got all that angst going on. And guess what? Is that a negative or a positive emotion? It's pretty stinking negative, isn't it? Yeah. And Jesus knew. And what he says, look, you got a way out. You got a way out. You don't need to be under the torturers. You do that to yourself. Because there was a way out. And that way out is called forgiveness. Letting it go. Letting it go. Forgiveness is the very thing that frees us to love and care for our brothers and sisters. Now, let me just say one quick word, because sometimes, there may be some of you who hear this and you kind of go, yeah, but, you keep on forgiving somebody and you're basically just enabling them to keep on doing the same bad stuff. Well, forgiveness is what's on your part. But the trick is there's not necessarily a connection. They're not the same thing as forgiving someone is not the same thing as trusting them. And sometimes there needs to be an adjustment in the trust factor and some boundaries set up in order to be wise. Because if that person's unrepentant, right, and continues to do that same thing, the only thing I can control is whether or not I forgive them. I can't control their actions, but I can make a wise decision to put a boundary in place that will stop me from having further hurt, right? But that's that's a topic for another day. In fact, I was talking with somebody in the church and they said, yeah, that's like a 6-month kind of, lots of things we could build around that. But I say all that to say is what we have control over is whether or not we forgive. And when we forgive, we get free. Why? Because we're letting it go. Letting it go. All right? Why else? And this is my last thing I'm going to share this morning. Why else would Jesus make such a big deal in this parable about the need to forgive and the importance of forgiveness? I would tell you one thing, is because he knows that in the human heart, and you notice in his conclusion, he says, you not only need to forgive, you need to forgive from the heart. He knew, and he knows, it's the hardest thing for us to do. Isn't it? Don't we think, I have a right. I have a right. You hear that on TV? Well, I have a right. You offended me, right? However that takes place. Well, within our human nature, nobody likes to be offended. Nobody likes somebody to trespass and to stomp on them. None of us like that, of course. And yet, I hear over and over and over, well, you don't know what they did to me, right? If you understood, what they did to me, then you would know why I can't forgive them. Really? What is it that God did for you? What is it that Jesus did for you? Right? Once we understand that piece, and we understand what Jesus did for us, we ought to be able to come to the place where we go, okay, no, look, for my own sake, I need to go ahead and let it go. That doesn't mean that from the heart is easy. And I think Jesus understood that. And I think he understood the prison that it puts people in if they fail to forgive. Let me just say this to you. I know for myself, when I have been deeply, deeply wounded, that whole forgiveness piece, it was really easy early on to just go, yeah, I forgive them. And then, a couple hours later, it's like, no, I didn't really forgive them. I wake up the next morning and it's like, all right, Lord, I know you want me to forgive them. So, Lord, I forgive them. And, it's like, So then later in the day, I'm thinking about it. I go, no, I really didn't forgive them. So why? Jesus knew this is the hardest thing. To forgive from the heart is the most healing, the most freeing, the thing that he could tell us to do as brothers and sisters in Christ. To be free of any of that is the most beautiful thing, because once it happens, and for me that usually happens after days and days and days, it's like processing. I'm like, oh, yeah, did I forgive him? Did I not forgive him? It's like, all right, Lord, I'm giving it to you again. And then one morning I wake up and I go, I forgave him from my heart, And I just had to keep choosing to forgive. But when that happens, when you come to that place where you really say, yes, I've forgiven from my heart, what is there? There's freedom. There's freedom to love. There's freedom to encourage. There's freedom to give grace. There's freedom to care about your brothers and sisters in spite of any of those things, because you know that you have the same King who you serve. Let's pray.